Welcome everyone. I think people are just joining us, but we're going to get started on time. I'm Sheena Arthur, I'm Partnership Manager here at Glasgow Council for the Voluntary Sector, and absolutely delighted to welcome you here today. We have an amazing group of people that Lynn has ably brought together, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion to come. We're using the chat function today, so please do, you'll see the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Please do use the chat function to say hello and who you are, and we have an opportunity for questions later on, so if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in there, and any comments as well. And be patient with each other, with the technology. We're all hoping it all goes well. And we are recording, so if you're more comfortable with your camera off, please feel free to do that. We're recording so that we don't lose any of the great input today, and so that we can share for those who can't be here today. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Angela O'Hagan, who's our chair for the event today, and Angela's from the Glasgow School for Business and Society, where she teaches quality, human rights and public policy, and she's also the Deputy Director of the Wise Centre for Economic Justice. So I'm going to hand over, and thank you so much, Angela, for being here today.
Thank you very much, Sheena. It's a real pleasure, and it's lovely to see not just so many people, but from a personal perspective, so many names of colleagues from across the sectors, and the range of interests that there are in our topic. I should apologise for my voice in the first instance. Hopefully it'll last the session. It's slowly coming back. The first thing I want to do is to thank Lynn Williams from GCVS for organising today's session and for inviting Scottish Women's Budget Group to be part of this session. I'm a long-standing member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group and the UK Women's Budget Group, and I'm currently a trustee of the newly reconfigured Scottish Women's Budget Group, so just in the interest of transparency there. But my thanks to Sarah Cowan at the Scottish Women's Budget Group for liaising with Lynn and setting this up. And I would, of course, encourage you all, if you're not already members of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, to sign up immediately after today's session and add your voice to the many activities around, including the advocacy for a care economy. My sincere thanks as well to our fantastic key contributors today. Rachel Statham of the Institute for Public Policy Research, who's here today as a member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group and also a member of the Management Committee. And to Michelle Carruthers. Michelle Carruthers will be of Food Train. My thanks as well to Sheena and other colleagues at GCVS for the marketing and the technical and other support in organising today and getting us to this stage. My Zoom has been playing up all week, so it's a roulette to see if my voice is going to last and my Zoom is going to last. So hopefully I'll be with you all the way through. And my huge thanks to all of you for joining us from across Scotland, and the chat's going great guns just now, which is really good to see. Lots of people from across Scotland, but I hear we've got colleagues from Canada and New Zealand as well, which is really, really exciting. So we're here today to discuss, can Feely lead to a care economy? A care economy is a phrase that many of you will be familiar with, some of you might not be. It's a phrase that we use a lot in the context of the women's budget groups, from a feminist economics perspective and feminist analysis of the economy. It's a really important session today in terms of the timing, as the consultation on the National Care Service is currently running. So again, I would encourage as many as possible to put together your responses and make sure a range of voices are heard again in this provision, because we know how quickly gender and intersectional analysis particularly can evaporate in public policy thinking, public policy deliberation. And that's part of our purpose today, is to talk about care economy in the context of the provision and receipt of care as a core starting point for economic and social policy. That care is absolutely one of the overriding public policy and public finance issues of our time. And that we need to, I would argue, use the experience and exposure of all the issues around care and care provision of the COVID pandemic to reset care as a political and economic imperative. No more clapping for heroes who are underpaid, if they're paid at all, underpaid, undervalued, but rather to see investment in care as central to our economic and social, collective and individual well-being. And in the Commission for a Gender Equal Economy, the final report from that initiative from the UK Women's Budget Group, we called for a care economy now. I see Itibar there in the chat, hello there. And we called for a care economy with 8 steps towards that economy, to that care economy. And central to that is investment in care as our social and economic infrastructure. So that's enough from me, and time to hear from our expert speakers. Rachel's going to talk for about 15 minutes and will bring us some perspective on the economics of a care economy. And then Michelle will take on the mic then with a perspective from the third sector, from an advocacy and service provision perspective. As Sheena has said, the session is being recorded and we'll use the chat function for questions. We're hoping to have about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for discussion on the care economy and particularly on the gender dimensions of care. So if you can put your questions in the chat, or if you can't do that, raise your hand and somebody will pick it up. Keep our questions focused and brief on the issues so as we can get through them all. So that's enough from me just now, and I'm going to mute and let Rachel start to speak to us. Thanks, Rachel.
Great, thanks very much, Angela. Hopefully you'll have some big purple slides showing up on your screen now. Can you see that okay? Great. Thanks so much for inviting me along today. I'm using new slide tech, so bear with me through technical challenges, but I do have a voice that hopefully is going to hold up. So we'll see how we go. What we wanted to do with this session, as Angela just outlined, is reflect on the Feeley Review, what that means from a kind of feminist economic perspective, and to start, hopefully, just to introduce some of the questions we might discuss in more detail through the rest of the session. So I think the big question is, how much closer does the recommendations that are contained in the Feeley Review, how much closer do they get us towards this vision of a caring economy? I thought we'd start by outlining what we mean by that. And as we at the Women's Budget Group kind of define a caring economy, it means acting together to improve well-being rather than to maximize economic growth. So that being the kind of central organizing principle of how you're organizing your economy, how you're kind of running economic development, and how you're using the kind of full apparatus of government to do that. So it's about what your ultimate objectives are and what your priorities are in delivering against those objectives. So it's a new way of thinking about the economy. We've seen from the Scottish Government, interest in the idea of a wellbeing economy. We've heard just through Programme for Government last week, interest in a kind of a caring country, that sort of language, and some definitive commitments towards moving away from a kind of set of traditional economic measures for how we value what our economy is doing, the kind of purpose it serves. But hopefully through the recommendations of the review and through the idea of a national care service, there's an opportunity at least to push that conversation on and to start to think in kind of intangible terms about what we could do to kind of maximise the impact that a new approach to social care provision in Scotland, or at least an improved approach, could do to kind of begin to close that gap between where we're at now and where we'd like to be. So where are we today? A lot of this won't be a surprise to many of you, but very clearly social care services in Scotland, as across the UK, are under enormous strain, and that that was on top of the considerable strain that we were observing before the pandemic. We know that demand is only increasing, both through demographic shifts. So Scotland's ageing population, we know Scotland's actually ageing faster than other parts of the UK as well. But also because of the kind of pent-up demand that's happened through people who haven't been able to access services that they need through the pandemic because of kind of service withdrawal. We've got this kind of pent-up kind of stored up demand for services that's only increasing pressure on provision. And then really critically, as I'm sure we'll get on to, pressure on unpaid carers as well, who are picking up the slack where services aren't able to meet people's needs. We also know that care work is chronically undervalued and critically undervalued across our economy. That's not a new story. That's kind of a story as old as time. But even today, when, as Angela said, we kind of have the provision of social care as a headline kind of political challenge, something that that is kind of getting the attention of ministers. We still see a formal care workforce that's severely underpaid. In which low pay is the norm rather than the exception, and then unpaid care is obviously being consistently overlooked in terms of design of policy. And we also know that our care commissioning models often aren't working in terms of delivering against the objectives we set for them, or in terms of delivering against people's needs, and delivering the kind of approach we'd like to see for to make the vision of a care economy a reality. So what's in the Feely review? I'm not going to recite, kind of the massive engagement process that contributed towards it, or the kind of wide range of recommendations it covers. But what I think is new that's interesting, particularly from a kind of feminist economic perspective, is kind of doubling down on the emphasis on a human rights-based approach to the kind of purposes of social care provision and what that might mean in practice. There is a welcome focus on unpaid carers and on making that work visible in a way that approaches to social care haven't made as clear in the past. And there's a real focus on improving standards of care and on closing the gap between what we say the kind of vision for social care Scotland services in Scotland might be, or what the government says that vision is, and what the reality on the ground looks like. I've got some building work that's just happening in the background, if you can hear those strange loud noises, but we'll bear with it. And then we've also got a proposal for a national care service. So on a kind of equivalent footing to the National Health Service, a vision for a different approach to the kind of principles of social care provision in Scotland, and hopefully the kind of profile of social care provision in terms of how much we value it, as a society, how much we're willing to invest in it, and we'll get into the detail of what that might mean through today's session. So that we'd also just address why this is a gender issue, why this is a kind of really core concern for feminist economists, and that's for a whole host of reasons. But here are kind of three of the headlines. The first is that women make up the majority of care recipients across Scotland. If you look at who actually accesses social care services, a lot of that is because women tend to, on average, live longer lives than men. We also know that women fill an estimated 84% of social care jobs across the UK. That's a new analysis we've done at IPR Scotland. We know that the actual care workforce is really feminised, and that it's women's work that's being undervalued when care work is undervalued. And we also know there's an estimated 1.1 million unpaid carers in Scotland, of which around 60% are women. So a majority of that unpaid workforce is also women. So this all adds up to a picture whereby failures of social care provision disproportionately impact women. But yeah, that has massive kind of spillover effects in terms of how it shapes the rest of our economy. So if we're not valuing care, the people that pick up the slack are disproportionately women. And it has massive knock-on impacts for women's participation in the formal labour market in terms of ability to go out and work to earn a wage. And and it has massive implications for how we think about how we organise society. If that care work that women are disproportionately providing is undervalued and made invisible, that means that we have an economy that's fundamentally not going to work for women and isn't going to deliver gender equality or gender justice. And why would we be making the case for investing more in care? So the Women's Budget Group has been making this case for a long time, and we're starting to see kind of some of these kind of economic arguments rehearsed in more mainstream spaces. So particularly through the kind of major social care debate we're having in Scotland, but also at the UK level, as a lot of you will have seen over the last week or so. So we know that care is social infrastructure. And what we mean by that is that care is just as important as bridges or roads or buildings, the kind of physical infrastructure projects that we see as kind of shiny top line government priorities often in budgets or other kind of fiscal announcements. And we know without social care and without care infrastructure, the rest of our economy isn't able to function. So people can't go out to work if their care needs aren't met, and people can't participate in society in a whole host of other ways. So we know that if children aren't cared for, if adults with care needs don't have those care needs met, it fundamentally limits our ability to participate either as people in receipt of care or as caregivers in our economy and in our wider society. So it's not kind of a contained kind of topic that can be left aside and kind of deprioritized. It has massive implications for the rest of our economy and how that functions too. We also know that demand for care is growing, but care needs are often going unmet. We've obviously seen this, critically through the pandemic. And we know that investment in quality care is also preventative investment. So if you don't spend money today, you're likely to have to spend more money down the line, from a kind of, fiscal, from the exchequer perspective, it makes sense to invest in care upfront. And we also know that this isn't a funding challenge that's going to go away in terms of the demand for greater investment in care. We also know that care jobs are growing, the demand, as demand for care grows. So there's an argument that investment in care supports job creation, and supports sustainable job creation as well. As we look at our environmental crisis, care jobs are not, they don't tend to be carbon intensive jobs. Care is a kind of fundamental human need. It's not a kind of extractive, kind of economic activity. And, it's part of our kind of foundational economy, as some economists put it. So investing in care jobs makes economic sense from a kind of wide range of perspectives, and that's just kind of a few of the very headline arguments for what people have written, massive and massive amounts of fascinating literature on. And we also know that investing in care jobs can be more effective in terms of job creation than investment in kind of physical infrastructure. So if you look at investing 2% of GDP in care, it creates twice as many jobs by Women's Budget Group estimates as the same money being invested in construction projects. So there's also kind of strong arguments in terms of what floats at the UK Treasury, at least, in terms of what you're going to get in return for that investment. So what does valuing care look like? What would a kind of care service, an approach to a care service that values care look like? What are the kind of tests it might need to meet? This is a kind of starting point, definitely not a definitive answer. But clearly we need services that meet people's needs and they're adequately funded. And I imagine funding is a question we're going to come back to through today. We need a service model that's run for people, not for profit. So what we see at the moment is a kind of trend of financialization in the care sector. And what we mean by that is ownership models where kind of absent kind of company owners, and particularly kind of long shareholders can ultimately control some private care providers in a way that means that they're run for kind of maximizing returns to shareholders rather than meeting the needs of people whose services who they're providing services to. So we need to question what the kind of economic models that underpin care provision and what they're doing and what their priorities are. Although obviously it's important to note there's a massive range of kind of models of provision across the sector, as a lot of you will be very familiar with. We need to see high quality care jobs and investment in the care workforce. And for me, that's a really critical test of when we'll be making progress, is when we actually begin to see that kind of playing out. So right now, the lack of investment in care jobs across Scotland and across the UK, although obviously there's some signs of improvement that we'll get onto, that's really indicative of our kind of failure to value care as kind of vital to the rest of our economy and our wider lives. And we also need to see recognition and support for unpaid carers, and that's through social security measures, so making sure that the unpaid carers who are doing vital work that the rest of our society, that our families and communities rely on, have adequate living standards, and that we have a social safety net that provides for that. But it also means making sure that they're recognised and responded to in terms of service provision as well. I think we've done this already. So, I think I'm going backwards by accident. We'll click forward. I think I've got overly clever slides today. Here we go. Oh. So what are the barriers we've got there to getting towards the care economy? So as I've mentioned, workforce quality, job quality across the care workforce is really poor. And if we look across a range of measures, this is some of my work with colleagues at IPPR, looking across the kind of UK-wide care workforce. We know that poor job quality isn't just concentrated in small pockets, it's really the norm. So if you look at those dark blue bars, which for the social care workforce, we know that 60% plus of carers are on low pay, so that's being paid less than the real living wage. We know that underemployment rates are really high, that's about 1 in 10, and that's where people want more hours than they're able to get. We know that it's the norm not to have any on-work kind of job, on-the-job training in the social care workforce. And we also know that these jobs are often insecure as well. So zero-hour contracts are quite prevalent across, compared to other sectors, as are temporary contracts. All that, affects, the answer to that question of whether or not we're actually valuing care. So what we've seen in Scotland is a commitment to collective bargaining for the social care workforce, and that's very welcome. And that was one of the highlights of the Feely review, was making the case for for improving conditions for the social care workforce. So setting minimum terms and conditions for workers, and also looking at making sure that we're using kind of all the available levers of government to boost paying conditions for the social care workforce as well. So real living wage procurement conditions, so where local authorities are commissioning services, making sure that they're commissioning them from providers who pay their staff a real living wage. And we could see through the National Care Service an opportunity to expand this kind of floor of conditions more broadly across the social care sector. But we're also going to need to see wider measures to drive up job quality. So that includes commitments to living hours, which we've seen kind of emerge as a Scottish Government priority. So that's making sure people have the hours they want. So dealing with that that bar on the last chart that shows that 1 in 10 social care workers don't have the hours they need to make ends meet, or the hours they want to work. And it also means commitments to training for the social care workforce and more progression opportunities, so that social care is seen as a kind of a career, and that in actuality social care workers have opportunities to progress and get on and work and build secure financially secure lives for themselves as the norm rather than the exception. I'm not going to dive into care quality today. That's definitely not my area of expertise, but just some of the kind of lessons that are important for thinking about how we might provide care services in a way that contributes towards a caring economy. The Feely review stresses services based on relationships, not transactions. I think that's really critical in terms of our thinking about what the objectives of a caring economy might be, and how we think about service provision and the kind of the aims of service provision within that. We also need to think about how we make decisions around access to services. Feely makes a case for access based on need. And it makes a case for addressing both cost and eligibility barriers that we know exist in the current provision system. But there are massive funding questions that are yet to be resolved, and we'll get onto that in a second. And And then there's also a lot of emphasis in the report on a renewed quality assurance framework on measures to improve service quality across Scotland. But what would be really important in ensuring that we have a kind of a future vision for services that provides for people's needs across Scotland, we're making sure that there's opportunities for both service users and carers to meaningfully shape the kind of design of local services and their delivery as well. So that kind of democratisation element is going to be really critical as we think about what that service design looks like in future, whatever the kind of shape of a national care service. And then the funding question, which is the kind of looming, the one that looms particularly large. The kind of short answer to whether or not Feely can get us towards an economy that fundamentally values care is it's probably too early to tell, in that we don't yet know what might be in scope of a national care service definitively. We've seen kind of things moved into that umbrella through the last few months and weeks, such as children's services as well as adult social care services. And so the kind of maths is quite hard to trace in terms of what level of investment will be needed to deliver high quality services across that kind of range of massive service provision. But what's likely from kind of early assessments is that there'll be more funding needed than has already been promised. We have seen from the UK government's announcement just in the last week that national insurance uplifts that increase to the national insurance rate will make a difference. Obviously, a chunk of that funding that's raised in Scotland will be going to the Scottish Government, and that will help budgets and planning at Holyrood. But there's still big questions about whether that's going to be able to kind of plug the gap that we currently see. And we've also seen in the recent programme for government for the Scottish Government a commitment to a 25% minimum spending increase in social care investment. So that's an additional £800 million by 2025-26, the end of this Parliament. But big question marks about exactly how and when we'll be able to work out whether that is a kind of an adequate funding settlement, and then obviously big questions about whether that's going to be sustainable in the future as demand continues to increase. So questions about taxation are definitely part of this conversation, and about how we might begin to prioritise care more profoundly across Scotland. And then finally, I thought we just finished with implementation gap that Feely raises, but is a kind of something that's talked about quite broadly across policy conversations in Scotland at the moment. So that's about the gap between kind of rhetoric, what the kind of Scottish Government's vision for future service provision or future kind of policy in Scotland is, and what the reality looks like on the ground. So I'm sure that'll be familiar to a few of you. I think what's really critical here is about beginning to fix processes in existing service delivery, rather than kind of giving a new shiny name and kind of new shiny idea that can be the centre of attention for the next decade. We need to be making sure that we're beginning to close that gap now, and the improvement is going to be happening on the ground rather than kind of 10 years from now, when we get around to deciding exactly what a national care service might look like or what it could deliver in practice. And we also know that this is a challenge that persists across public services in Scotland. So just last week, the Auditor General was reflecting on 10 years since the Christie Commission on Public Service Provision in Scotland. And this gap is really clear, that we, what's kind of described as a vision of public service in Scotland isn't what people are seeing in reality. So that's a more profound challenge, but one that's even more urgent because of that. So I think my kind of concluding thought is we're going to have to wait and see how far a national care service could begin to kind of realise this vision for a caring economy. But there's definitely kind of green shoots and some kind of hopeful potential for progress. And I'm sure we can hear from lots of you about your views too. But I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Have we lost Angela?
Yeah, I think we might have done, Rachel. I don't know. Sheena, do you want to pick up? Okay,
yeah. I was just checking if we had lost Angela. It looks like she's here, but maybe lost connection.
By the way,
thank you so much, Rachel. I've got I know we'll get your slides, but I've got loads of notes here because there's so much to think about and some really powerful things to think about there in terms of women and that unpaid workforce, but also the impact on in the sector of the paid workforce. So it's just great to have so many people here that we can start to have some conversations about this. So thank you so much for, I'm overwhelmed with what questions we've got. So we will have time for discussion, and please do put any thoughts or questions. If, like me, you're probably processing all that information and things to think about, particularly if you're a woman working. Oh, Angela's just appeared as I'm rabbiting on here. Is Angela, I don't know if she's actually...
Yeah, I think she's lost
not with us. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that. So as you're thinking, if you've got comments, please add them in as well, because that might generate a question for later as well. So we're going to move on to hear from Michelle Carruthers, who we're delighted is here as CEO of the Food Train, who many of you will be familiar with the amazing work of the Food Train across the city and beyond. So we're delighted Michelle is here to give an input from and for the third sector. And thanks, Michelle. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, super. Thanks, Sheena. I think my mic's on and hopefully you can see and hear me all right.
Yep,
so
great.
Thank you for the opportunity to join me today and offer you some of my reflections. As ever, I can't speak on behalf of the whole sector as it's so diverse, but I can bring you some insights from a charity that's been supporting older people for 26 years across Scotland with some informal supports that very much supports the formal social care provision in Scotland. And I think it'd be fair to say, you know, over the 19 years that I've worked specifically with Food Train, and in all the years I worked in nursing before that, specifically in care of older people, I certainly have witnessed the changing face of social care from a number of different perspectives. And the gender imbalance of social care is reflected very strongly here at Food Train. From our membership of over 3,000 older people, 72% are female, and 80% are aged over 75, and then 44% are actually aged over 85, and 76% are living alone. And the primary reasons for needing our support and services are generally linked to reduced mobility, difficulties with shopping and cooking, deteriorating health overall, and loneliness. So I just want to offer you a little bit of reflection on the Adult Social Care Review, a bit of perspective around you know, the stories of our older members, and what I think needs to go back into social care. So the Social Care Review report recommendations of a new national care service I found to be quite heavily weighted around the structures and the institutions of how care is provided and organised and commissioned. For me, some of it's a bit about who's in charge. But I really applaud the ambitions of the review around achieving person-centred care, human rights-based care, and the stronger inclusion of carers. But for me though, the report fell short and the review fell short in one significant area, and that was taking the opportunity to review the legislation that underpins what social care actually is for people at the sharp end, namely the Health and Community Care Scotland Act of 2002, which introduced free personal nursing care to Scotland. And this act sets out the list of personal care tasks that may not be charged for. So it defines what people actually receive as social care. It's the starting point. It's about bathing, washing, dressing, feeding, continence, medication, aids, getting in and out of bed and so on. It's a medical model based around daily living tasks. Care is packaged around these tasks based on assessments and eligibility criteria. It's a doing to model, not a doing with model. So Feely's recommendations are packaged around three areas: shifting the paradigm, strengthening the foundations, and redesigning the system. So on that basis, I had expected some really big questions, challenging whether the legislation that underpins what social care is, whether that is actually person-centred, human rights-based, and strongly enough includes carers. So for me, this review is a bit like expecting the orchestra to sound different without changing their music. The planned new National Care Service may become the orchestra for social care, but for me, the music's going to still be the same. So unless this legislation is examined, unless it's challenged about being more person-centred and rights-based, then social care provision will always come from a place of telling people what care is, of defining what they can get from a medicalised task list, and therefore women will continue to be disproportionately affected by this legislation. So greater life expectancy for women doesn't come as a free gift. Yes, we can expect women to live longer lives than their predecessors, but it also means that more older women than men use health and social care services, more older women than men are carers, paid and unpaid, and more older women can expect to live more years in ill health than older men. And long before COVID, FoodTrain had been amplifying the voices of our older members, sharing their experiences of a care system that has created a postcode lottery of services and access, wide variations around the country defining what help is and who can get it and when they can get it. And our particular lens is around food. So the exclusion of food access is a care need, and the total absence of food, of seeing food as part of well-being, is a real issue. But the pandemic changed things. Suddenly getting food to older people became super important, in fact, urgent. It became everyone's business, yet it wasn't a new problem created by the pandemic. The issues older people face around food access, around choice, and many other elements of social care, transport and so on were already there, created by legislation that underpins social care, which says getting food to older people isn't on the task list, eating for health isn't on the task list, eating to prevent malnutrition isn't on the list, eating socially to prevent loneliness isn't on the list, getting out your home to do social things isn't on the list. The pandemic simply made these existing challenges worse. During last year, our food access service went up by 80%, and we provided over 70,000 deliveries of fresh groceries. Our volunteers cooked and shared over 12,000 home-cooked meals to our members most in need, and we made over 10,000 check-in calls over a 6-month period. And the stories that we heard were repeated up and down the land. Many of the new older members joining our service during the pandemic reported the loss of meal visits and care packages, eating only cold food every day, a cold cereal breakfast and a cold sandwich left out for later instead of proper meals. The vast majority of new members joined our service because they had absolutely no other way of getting help. One older lady in particular reported her care visits being slashed from 4 in the day to 2, and their visit times being extended up to a 2.5-hour slot. So getting up and breakfast some days at 7, some days at 9:30, getting something to eat later on and going to bed, sometimes at 7 in the evening or sometimes 9:30. So some days she could get up at 7 and get something to eat and eat nothing else until 9:30 in the evening. She reported that over a 6-month period, she had seen 59 different carers and had become despondent that her only option was to go into a home. But saying that her regular weekly calls from FoodTrain, the regular weekly volunteers coming to deliver the food, they were the consistent and reliable things in her life. Another older lady getting acutely anxious if the supermarket had run out of the ready meals she needs. Not the ones she likes, but the ones she needs, the ones that take less than 6 minutes, because that's all the time allocated to the meal element of her care visit. So needless to say, our staff and volunteers have spent and still do spend countless hours helping our older members to compile shopping lists that help them eat better, but within often their limitations of their own abilities and that of the carers and the care system. Over the last 2 years, through our specific project tackling malnutrition, Eat Well, Age Well, we've also provided screening for over 2,000 older people living at home, mainly older women, some getting care and some not. Of those not receiving any other social care, 17% coming to us were already at risk or malnourished. However, those coming to us in receipt of formal social care, that rose to 31%. So the care system is effectively starving older people and older women in particular. So if I have one significant reflection about the recommendations for a new national care service, it's that it's time for the medicalised model to go. It's time to be asking people, what matters to them, what care and support they need. And it's certainly time to put the social back in social care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And my thanks to Rachel as well. I'm sorry I dropped out, lost my connection as Rachel finished. But huge thanks there to you both. And Michelle, you have ended your contribution on some really trenchant challenges and graphic realities really on the quality currently of social care. And so if the intention of the care review was to present a paradigm shifting model, you've presented a central contention there that the paradigm cannot shift unless the legislation, unless those core instruments are also reformed, and unless, and this is reflected in a comment in the chat from Kirsten Rumery as well, that so long as people in using care services and providing care services are not involved in the design and production, co-production of services, then that paradigm is not going to be shifted. And that links as well to Rachel's many excellent points, including on workforce reform. We know the data, 1.5 million care workers working for private companies earning less than £8.50 an hour, with pay falling behind supermarket workers, cleaners and sales assistants. So again, coming back to what in the 20 years or more that I've been involved in this area, we've always talked about a question of values. What do we value? Whose work do we value? Whose care do we value and how? And we're still there. And so I'm very concerned, having listened to you both, about where there is strong rhetoric in the current discussion on reform, but that the paradigm still has to shift in terms of that core valuing of care. The giving and receiving of care has to be a core political value. So what would be, from the issues that you have both raised, what key changes, are there one or two key changes that you want to see, you think are imperative now in the consultation period around this? What absolutely key messages would you have? I'll come to Rachel and let Michelle get her voice back and come back in.
Yeah, I think that was extremely well made points, Michelle. I think the kind of core, I think from a workforce perspective, the core kind of solution for me is to have a trade union bargained floor for terms and conditions. We've heard promises of that as it's kind of understood, I think, to be the solution, but we still haven't seen real progress towards actually being a reality. We know what the reality of care workers across a range of different types of provision still is, and I think what we don't have an answer to yet, as you raised, Angela, is private providers and improving the standard of employment practice in the private sector, and if we're serious about a national care service being a kind of holistic solution to how we value care and how we provide care in Scotland, we're going to have to think beyond improving pay just to a living wage standard and think we've kind of done the job within local authority commission care. There's going to have to be a much wider kind of workforce strategy to drive that change. And then I'd absolutely echo the points you've both been making around kind of co-design of services being absolutely critical. You can deliver services that aren't meeting people's needs under a different model, and call that kind of transformative progress, but we know it's not going to be transformative progress in the direction that we need to see it, unless we seriously think about what the services we're providing actually look like, as well as the commissioning models that underpin them.
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like you to maybe think on from that, and we'll come back to questions with you around public financing and measures to raise revenue. But Michelle, what would be your key challenges?
I think for me, until we come to the notion that the starting point for social care at home has to be a conversation with the person about what that means to them, then everything else is just going to be tinkering around the edges with the structures of all this. If we don't include that as the very fundamental basic principle, what matters to you? And this could be any of us, none of us know what tomorrow. And what matters to each person can be different. So just working from a set list that, you know, local partnerships have to on a statutory basis, provide a certain amount of something, and that's what's measured. That's where we have to see the biggest shift, and that can only come with an examination of the legislation. And then for me, the marketisation of social care in a way that we've allowed, that we haven't allowed with the NHS. I mean, if you imagine we did with hospitals and GP practices, how we allow social care to operate, you know, it's just unimaginable, isn't it? So until we change this relationship of purchaser-provider, you know, doing to rather than doing with, we really aren't going to see these big fundamental shifts that this report talks about. And you know, I've worked through big programs like Reshaping Care for Older People that used all of the same language. You know, worked through times when you know we resettled older people out of hospital into the communities, and this language is still being talked about at this sort of strategic level. But it's where it comes out and into people's homes that's the critical bit. So it absolutely has to start with what matters to you and what you receive as care.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I mean, Kirsten's raising a point in the chat here about the framework of self-directed support, but where well-meaning legislation has not been properly funded or supported. And I think tying your points together with one of the things that really struck me in the report, in the Feely report, is, and you've raised it already, Michelle, is the emphasis on institutions. And the emphasis on using structures which, fair enough, haven't been around for terribly long, but which have not been without criticism, shall we say, in terms of, you know, the integrated joint boards. And one of the ways that we see the kind of disjuncture between some of the structures that we have and some of the rhetoric that we have, and where the legislation doesn't touch the sides of those concerns, is again through something like the public sector equality duty, and where that analysis, that starting point, and again, you know, to have a human rights and equalities starting point in care provision is not yet part of the practice, part of the character of services. Now, that's not to say that service providers and public authorities are not interested in that. I don't mean to be misunderstood there. But in terms of process and a systematic engagement with the public sector equality duty, for example, as an enabling and transformative way to go about services rather than being seen as punitive. And that's been widely reported by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and others. And so in terms of shifting that, you know, if the institutions are not to be changed, as per the Feely report, our conversation today suggests that that's problematic. If the intention, which we've agreed are bold and necessary around a human rights-based approach, co-production, are to be realised in practice, what actions then are necessary? And I put this question not just to Michelle and then Rachel, but to everybody else listening. What actions have to happen from across the care sector? And the wider sector? As Rachel said in her contribution, this is a conversation that needs to happen not just in relation to social care. This is a conversation that needs to happen across all aspects of public policy and public finance. So what are your thoughts, Michelle, on what actions from the sector and elsewhere?
You have to start on where the power lies. And the person who is in receipt of social care has to be the primary holder of the power. So that's the entire opposite end of the spectrum of where the power sits now. So the power to give, the power to decide who gets, the power to pay for, all of that rests over there. The power to even agree who provides sits way over the other end of the spectrum. And the person is the recipient, is the done to. So there has to be a massive cultural, economic and a shift in every way imaginable across to the person. And that, you know, that comes with risks. But, you know, as a mature society, you know, we have to accept that we won't make any of these big changes unless this just isn't about a small shift. It's about wholesale across the piece, every bit. Take it all back, take it towards the people who are in receipt of social care, because that's where the power should be.
Absolutely, and that links or resonates with the point that Susan McKinstry's raised in the chat here, that we need to move away from deficiency models and talking with people about what they can't do, and that decapacity, can't use that word, can't say it, but that completely undermining of individuals. And we see that in so many ways. You know, one of the things that Rachel and others, we've had lots of conversations on, you know, Kirsten Rumery and others, talking about economic activity and how people are regarded as not economically active if they're carers, or if they're in receipt of care. And it's, you know, it's something that really gets me going, and many of us, because it's about how institutionally people are then constructed, and where value is placed on economic activity, and where economic value is placed on individuals, and that people are just written off. And I think what we're seeing today is we're still not seeing those monoliths of thinking properly having been chipped away at. And Lynn raises an interesting point in the chat here, which is that, is it because it's women who are primarily caregivers and carers? Is it because women are primarily in receipt of care that these questions of power, these questions of value, these questions of remuneration and being valued are not being addressed? And I thought it was interesting that in the Feely report, if I can just find the phrase, the report says, the social care workforce in Scotland is so notably disadvantaged because it is highly gendered. The sector is about 83% female. Were it 83% male, it simply would not be marginalised and undervalued as it is. Now, that's a very bold statement from Feely that absolutely must require a political response and a response in policy. I'm just having a wee look down. And as Lynn has pointed out, that the expectation continues socially that women will give up paid work in order to give more hours of unpaid care. Kirsten's raising some questions about investment in childcare and the big economic arguments. Now, Rachel, you touched on that, and you touched on the data from Sue Himmelweit and Jerome de Henau in the Women's Budget Group, that for investment of around 2% GDP, we see twice as many jobs being created in the economy as elsewhere. And that usual, when we think about infrastructure investment as things we can build and point at rather than care. So picking up on that, where do you see the economic levers and the fiscal levers to boost care investment and to pay for care services?
Yeah, that's an all-important question, isn't it? So I think you know, if we look across the kind of full range of potential you know, fiscal levers, so at the UK level to start with, IPR made the case for tax on wealth, so equalising tax on earnings from wealth with earnings from work. So that's increasing capital gains tax to have a similar regime to the income tax regime, and we estimate that I think that would raise about £90 billion over 5 years. So that's obviously at the UK level, but that could begin to fund a social care settlement that looks sustainable. It could play at least a kind of significant role. And then within Scotland, I think there's also conversations to have about the role that local tax could play. I think it would have to be a combination of taxes if we're talking about what's within the devolved settlement at the moment. If there's not kind of major action, depending on how much we think there is left to close the gap, based on the national insurance shift we've seen at the UK level. there's potential around local, local level initiated things like estate taxes, things like levies, reforming the small business rebate as it kind of currently stands. So there are options available, basically. Like, there are political choices that could be made from the Scottish Government now, and obviously there is decisions to be made about how the funding that's going to come from this national insurance contribution, whatever you make of it, whether you think that's the right decision in terms of whether it constitutes progressive taxation or not, we're going to get consequentials to the Scottish Government, and once we've kind of worked out how far that's going to fill an NHS shortfall, and how far there will even be funds that can be invested into increased spending over the long run in social care. There's going to be a tax question left over, basically, and we need to think about a serious political commitment and kind of serious societal commitment to adequate and sustainable funding of social care, because it isn't a challenge that's going away, and I don't think the answers we've had from UK government over the last week are going to be adequate to kind of put that question to rest.
Thanks, Rachel. So that there are, I think amongst the very practical and specific suggestions that you made there around different options in tax policy, you also made the very key point that these are political choices, and that requires having the political will to have a conversation on taxation, which is something that I think we are still collectively, there is still a tentativeness around. And then when we do see action on taxation, in my view, the actions from the Westminster government and the targeting or using national insurance as the instrument is one of the most cack-handed that we've ever seen, really, in terms of using one of the most regressive tax instruments that will directly impact the very workers that are most affected by undervalued and low pay in the sector. And that links to a question that Kirsten has raised in the chat, which is there any appetite that you know of for an employer-employee contribution-based social care insurance scheme, so that specific raising of a contribution for social care?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably what some of the kind of UK government ministers responsible for the national insurance contribution would say that they're moving towards. Although, yeah, I think that's the kind of, as you say, an example of what a bad levy might look like, whereas one that's based on employer contributions, and thought through with kind of quite different principles in mind, might have got us a lot further. I think we basically need a bigger political conversation than we've had. It's not a question that's settled, given, as you said, the kind of cack-handed response we've had from the UK government. But there are also, obviously choices available to the Scottish government, and we're going to have to see, that kind of thinking, I think, around, the role that employers could have in a more sustainable funding settlement.
Great, thank you. And just on that, there are consultations running just now on tax policy. The Scottish Women's Budget Group, amongst others, are putting together member perspectives to inform the Scottish Women's Budget Group response to taxation. So please get involved and share your ideas, and we can put them forward in the proposals. And Sarah in the chat here has put a link to the UK Women's Budget Group responses to last week's announcement or the vote in the UK Parliament. Michelle, I want to come back to you for the last word on the points you've made and that have been picked up by colleagues in the chat on medicalisation, and that paradigm shift that you said there needs to be institutional reform and changes in the structures, the core legislative instrument, and stop talking past one another in terms of legislative and institutional change. But core to that is the individual, is the person. So what would be your last word on how to how to bring about that change from the medical model to a social and inclusive model? Small question to end on, Michelle.
I suppose it just all comes back to the requirement legally of the statutory agencies to provide to people. And that principle of how something is done to is absolutely, it has to be completely and utterly turned on its head. And it should start with the person that requires or has the need, is then able to work with a range of organisations, agencies, whoever, to meet those needs, to live the best life that they can. And that's a complete and utter 180 from the principles that underpin this legislation. So we have to be prepared to tear it up. And people say, oh, well, we can't go back. But not everything about how we did everything in the past was bad. Because if you look at models we used previously, our social care model was built around much more social, individual, holistic needs. But we have to accept that the extent to which the population requires social care has moved on significantly. So that means repurposing the legislation with that in mind, but absolutely with a whole new set of principles that puts social back into social care, and that starts with the person.
That's great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you to Rachel. I'm going to give the last word to Sheena, and I think there have been lots of actions. The discussion in the chat about employers seen as core partners in childcare. And again, we need to shift that dial in relation to social care. The FEELE recommendations around relationships and partnerships is absolutely something that I'm sure is front and centre for Sheena and for organisations like GCVS. And those challenges that Michelle has emphasised around those institutional and structural relationships, I think, are core to one of the core levers. So if we're looking at the cogs, we have public finance and fiscal policy. We have conceptually how we're thinking about care and a person-centred approach to care, and how the power that drives the cogs has to come from the individual and not from the institutional interests. There's some very specific questions to follow up today, not least on taxation and tax policy in Scotland and the different options that there are. Lynn had raised a point about the gender pay gap commitment from 2018 in relation to the workforce, which is a really useful reminder that commitments are made and evaporate, or it can disappear, and we need to keep bringing them back into the mix. And Rachel made that point in her comments earlier. So I'm going to leave off and come back to Sheena to close the session, but with my thanks to Michelle and Rachel for phenomenal presentations today and all the time that's involved in putting them together. Thank you very much. And to colleagues for your questions and comments and insight and challenge and passion in the chat. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you and to read your comments. And hopefully we can do some of this in person again in the not too distant future. But until then, my thanks, and back to Sheena.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you to Rachel and Michelle, having you here raising the points and getting us thinking about this. There's so much, and I think there's some key themes that have come up in our conversations already within our World Reimagined. And this, I liked Michelle's, can we put the social back into social care? I think that's a really good question and challenge for us. But this power dynamic is coming up time and again. And for me, it's really, I think, really powerful having you on our panel as women, with the knowledge and the influence and experience that you have, that I'm sat here wondering, if there's so many women that are key stakeholders in all of this, why do we feel, what are we waiting for, And that's something I really want us to reflect on, really. Lynn and colleagues, we were talking this week about all the amazing women we've got around us and being empowered to create change. And should we have a women's health and social care group network? And I feel like I don't even want to ask, I want to just, let's do that. But I'd like to ask people, would they be interested in that? Because it strikes me that there's so much we already know and that we can already do. And it is a genuine question, what is it that's stopping this happening if we already know? And we've got so much to offer. So, and having people at the centre of this is really critical. So how do we do that? What would that look like for it to be different? So I'm summing up with lots of questions. Sorry about that, but it's been so thought-provoking, and thank you so much. And we will bring these conversations. I think it's clear we need more than an hour for this discussion. So I think if colleagues are happy to be involved in another discussion, then we'd really like to develop some of the discussion from today. So thank you all, and just thanks for participating today. It's been great to have you all here.